Motley Crue's longtime manager, Allen Kovac, is firing back at Mick Mars after last week the legendary guitarist filed a lawsuit against the band. He says after he announced his retirement from touring, they attempted to reduce his share in the business. And he says, just because you retire from a position doesn't mean you give up your ownership stake in a band. And now Allen Kovac is pushing back on a number of what he feels are falsehoods. He says that he regrettably is having to speak about this. He says that Nikki Sixx is very frustrated and quite frankly hurt about this. He says he still loves Mick Mars and really cares about him and doesn't want this to play out this way. They're also saying that the lawsuit itself is really just about obtaining records from the business, and they feel as though it was unnecessary to go into all of these other details in the lawsuit that really at the core have nothing to do with what the actual basis of the suit is, which is to obtain records from Motley Crue so they can look into the finances. But needless to say, there is a lot happening. Variety, I've linked to the description of their coverage. They have done a fantastic job getting information and laying it all out there for everyone to see. So I encourage you to read the entire thing. And of course, as for Mick Mars, he says he is not backing down. He says he's done that in the past. This time he is very serious. And of course, they've also spoken to Mick Mars' attorney, who again is reiterating just because someone retires from the business. He says when Jeff Bezos stepped down from Amazon, he didn't give up his ownership stake in the band. And we're talking about the difference between being a member of a group and touring with them and corporate business law is what he's saying. And that just because Mick in fact retired from touring does not exclude him from actual ownership of the business. Now, I conducted a poll from you, the audience, and I wanted to get your take on it. We have over 14,000 votes on this poll here on the Rockfeed YouTube channel. And it's simple. The question, Team Motley Crue or Team Mick Mars? 90% right now, as the time of this recording, are on Team Mick Mars and 10% are on Team Motley Crue with over 14,000 votes in. And on the Motley Crue side of things, they're saying we're trying to be reserved here. We're not trying to hit below the belt. And they feel as though some of the things that Mick Mars have said is unnecessary. And they're also responding to the claims that the members of Motley Crue were playing to pre-recorded tracks. They are denying much of what is being said there. And so there's a lot here. Allen Kovac was very transparent about this entire situation. I thought what he had to say was very interesting. Stick around. Before we continue, if you're new to Rockfeed, be sure to subscribe with notifications on for the latest rock news and future updates on this story. And also, we've teamed up with our friends at DWP to give away 4 VIP weekend passes to one lucky winner to one of these amazing festivals of your choices. The lineups are mind-blowing. I can't wait to see Pantera, obviously. And if you've never been in the VIP, I'm telling you, you've got to experience this. It's truly mind-blowing. Enter to win at the link in the description. So now we have this brand new interview from Variety where they speak to Allen Kovac. He's obviously been in the industry and accomplished so much over the course of his legendary career. And he's saying, I really don't want to be talking about this, but in fact, Nikki Sixx was very upset. I told him I'm going to talk about this because he's very frustrated. By the way, all of this has gone down, and here's what he had to say. Kovac told Variety, I have a lot of regret that I'm having to do this, the attorney says, pointing out that he talked Nikki Sixx, the group's unofficial leader, out of talking to the press himself, wanting the bassist to keep taking the high road. Later, he says, Mars is coming out with a list of allegations to gain leverage in a smear campaign on Motley. He attacked the band, and he's done it in a slanderous way, with false accusations and misrepresenting the facts to the fans. Mick is not the victim. The victims are Motley Crue and the brand, which Mick is so prideful of. He goes on to say he's always gotten along with Mick over the years in the last 3 decades. He said, what's upsetting to me is not Mick, but his representatives who have guided Mick to say and do harmful things to the brand he cares about so much, Motley Crue. He has a degenerative disease and people are taking advantage of him. It's called elder abuse. Mick's representatives have no idea what they've created, but I've stopped the band from speaking about this, so they're not going to turn the fans against Mick. But I'm going to make sure that people understand that Mick hasn't been treated badly. In fact, he was treated better than anyone else in the band, and they carried him and they saved his life. Now, I've seen some of you in the comments reference this, that Nikki Sixx, of course, famously got a tattoo of Mick Mars to show his loyalty to him, and Mars' attorney is actually responding specifically to that because Kovac referenced it, and he says, just because you get a tattoo of someone does not mean you get to oust them from your band's corporations and LLCs 41 years after they start with you. Of course, in response to this lawsuit, there was also a number of declarations from Motley Crue employees that felt that Mick Mars was not playing as good as he used to. And you can read a number of those declarations in this Variety article in the description. But in response to that, Mars' attorney says this: "It is interesting that these declarations about Mick's playings are from employees of Motley Crue who rely on the band for their livelihood. I noticed that there are no declarations from anyone about the other members playing or not playing. Did you ever wonder why Motley Crue's lawyers drafted declarations stating that Mick was unfit to perform successfully on tour and had them signed, albeit by people whose livelihoods depend on pleasing Motley Crue, in response to Mick announcing that he is retiring from touring? If Mick is so bad, isn't it a matter of problem solved? The bottom line is that this case is not about whether or not Mick can still play. It is not even about whether the band members are playing anything at all. But if you're going to gather disparaging declarations from employees and kick someone out of the band for not playing properly, ironically, after he tells you he can no longer handle touring anymore, you better get out of your glass house." Now, in response to those claims that Motley Crue plays to pre-recorded tracks on stage, their manager Allen Kovac says that is simply not the case. He said everything is live with Nicky's bass playing and Tommy's drum playing. When they've used loops, they're still playing. There are augmented vocals, which were recorded in the studio and are background behind the two ladies who are singing, and other background vocals by John 5 and Nikki 6, and before that, Mick and Nikki. He describes the pre-recorded vocal layering as, "You multi-track and you do gang vocals with like 20 people, just like all the other bands do with background vocals. They've got background vocals in the mix. That's the truth." But Nikki played his bass and always has. Vince was singing better than he has before on the latest tour. That was in reviews. Now, John 5 is playing like who John 5 is. I've heard John 5 perform and I heard Mick perform. Both are great guitar players. Unfortunately, Mick is not the same. He hasn't been the same for a long time, which was in reviews. You see, the professionals knew. Def Leppard knew. And Mars caused a train wreck up there because he would play the wrong songs and the wrong parts, even with the guide tracks. When he played the wrong song, it wasn't Nikki 6 that had a tape. It was the sound man bringing it into the mix so the audience could hear his song, even though the guitar player was playing a different song. He says audiences would hear it at first, but sound engineers would fix it so that we could keep the song going. I heard it. I'd go to the soundboard. So in response to that, Mars' attorney says that, in fact, they're in the process of going through YouTube videos to see if the playing lines up with their movements on stage. And he also says what he wants people to understand is that just because he retired from touring, he's still a shareholder in the overall business. And just because, for example, someone like Jeff Bezos might retire from Amazon, it doesn't mean he still doesn't have an ownership stake in the company overall. He told Variety, "We have already started the process of checking multiple fan accounts and other videos, as I'm sure others are doing right now, to see if their movements match the sound. However, once again, whether the rest of the band played live or not, and whether Mick has had playing issues or not, the most important fact here is that he is a shareholder of the band's corporate and LLC entities. You don't lose your shares just because you play the wrong note after 41 years. No, resigning from touring or even from the band entirely is not resigning from the band's corporations and LLCs. Corporate law doesn't work that way. If Jeff Bezos stopped working at Amazon someday, he still gets to own the company. So does Mick." Now, Kovac fired back on that point. He says that the band has sold their publishing previously, so the entire business is pretty much based upon touring. He said, "There's nothing left. What is left? There are no record royalties because the band in 2021 sold their mastered recordings." He says there are no publishing royalties or income from performances or neighboring rights. What is left? What does he want to do? And Kovac did go on to acknowledge that the band did make an offer to Mick Mars for 5% and then up to 7.5%, which of course Mick Mars felt insulted by. He said he was offered a terrific opportunity. An offer was made to him at 5% and then up to 7.5% to avoid this. What Mick's asking for is an equal share, 25%. But there's a guy named John 5 in the band. Mick resigned from touring, and John 5's getting paid. So who's going to pay John 5? None of this makes sense. They've got a 2023 tour. They're about halfway through. So let's estimate $150 million in gross. And then you take off for production and commissions, and let's call it 100 or 110 million. What's a 7.5% of that? He says it's an insult. And you've got me quoting that the other two guys got 0 when they were out of the band, meaning Vince Neil and Tommy Lee during the periods they left the group. So where's the insult? Kovac is pointing out there that both in the past when Tommy Lee and Vince Neil left the band, neither one of them got touring revenues during their time away from the group. He says, I think Mick is part of the 1%. Please put that on the record. Let's say it was 7.5% of 110 million. Could you live on that, even if you have tens of millions already? And then there's that document that Motley Crue references from 2008, when they say that every member of the band voted for and agreed to that if anyone left the group and retired from touring or for any other reasons, they wouldn't be entitled to future revenue. Variety says of that document, which they've reviewed, Variety obtained the 2008 amendment, and it's clear on some points, possibly more ambiguous on others, despite the signees' intention to set things straight once and for all at the time. It reads in part, in the event that any shareholder no longer renders services in MC, then no amount of purported value shall be attributable to the trademarks at the time of resignation, but all such trademarks shall continue to be the exclusive property of the corporation. In the event that any shareholder resigns from performing and or rendering services in MC, he shall not be permitted to continue to use the trademarks for any purpose whatsoever, notwithstanding anything contained herein to the contrary. In the event shall any resigning shareholder be entitled to receive monies attributable to live performances, i.e. tours. Motley Crue's litigation attorney has also weighed in, and they say that they felt that all of the stories that were contained in the lawsuit by Mick Mars were completely unnecessary. The lawsuit that Mick filed is a petition for writ of mandate to obtain certain records. It's a perfunctory request that consists of nothing more than a couple of pages. There was absolutely no need for Mick to tell a 41-year history of the band, badmouth Nicky by claiming that 100% of his bass parts were recorded, and any of the other flurry of lies that he made. These allegations have nothing to do with his request for corporate records. It is completely irrelevant and superfluous, and no code or case law requires such allegations to be made to get documents. Kovac goes on to say that both he and Nikki Sixx went above and beyond 2 decades ago to help Mick Mars get clean. I said, okay, Nikki, something's wrong. If you guys haven't heard from him for 2.5 years, let's go to his house and find out if he's even alive. And when we knocked the door down, because Mick couldn't walk, he could only crawl. He needed a hip operation. Nikki had him sleep at his house and go to some doctors where I had different people from my company taking him. He weighed all of 89 pounds. There was a documentary called The Resurrection, and it shows the debate of whether to bring Mick Mars back. When Mick wasn't capable, the band waited a long time while he healed, and even after healing, he was never the same. Though he's been on the road ever since. I call that support. I hope you print that because that's true, and ask Mick, how'd you get those doctors? Did you stay at Nikki Sixx's house when people were debating about you being in the band or not? Did you end up in the band despite disappearing for 2.5 years and having to rehab for 2 years after that? I think that's important. Did Nikki get a tattoo to show you he would never do anything to harm you? Did you try to harm him by throwing him out of the band because you thought he stole your publishing? Did you prevail? The answer, Kovac says, is no. Did he forgive you? Which you did, because we all knew he was being taken advantage of. Everyone kept him in the band, but Mick never apologized, and Nikki's still loyal. And again, as for Nikki Sixx, he was bummed out by this entire situation. He responded to the news at the time, writing, "Sad day for us. We don't deserve this considering how many years we've been propping him up. We still wish him the best and hope he finds lawyers and managers who aren't damaging him. We love you, Mick." This is obviously a very contentious legal dispute between Motley Crue and Mick Mars. We're going to be following it closely, so be sure to subscribe with notifications on and join the conversation with Rockfeed over on Instagram.